episode 240. Welcome to Data Skeptic, a podcast about data science and fake news from an algorithmic perspective. Here's your host, Kyle Polich.
All right, Linda, today's topic stretches the definition of what can fall under fake news a little bit. You know, what's the opposite of fake? Truth, right? So I want to talk about a concept that's very important in data science called the single source of truth.
The single source of truth. Sounds like something some omnipotent God would say, huh?
All right, you don't have to go all spiritual on it. Let's just keep it corporate.
You asked me.
Yes,
what
I did.
I thought of. So keeping it corporate. Well, we actually had this conversation because we were talking about databases
Yes.
and data. And you told me that BI and data people like to know about the single source of truth.
Yeah, you're getting a little technical. Can you define for the audience what BI is, and just in case?
Business insights, I guess. Is that what it stands
Usually
for?
business intelligence.
Intelligence. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I just said insights.
Which that'll be a department, much like a data scientist. It's a term that gets broadly applied, and not everybody does the same thing. But generally speaking, somebody in BI is responsible for giving the metrics of the company, collecting them and delivering them to everybody.
Yeah, so that's a big task. 'Cause
Yeah.
There's a lot of data, and it's very valuable if we know how to interpret it, find it, gather it.
That's right. Now, have you ever encountered a situation where people couldn't agree on the facts? No, different people had different numbers for something?
In business, I think it's not that people have different numbers, it's that they don't have any numbers.
Sometimes, yeah, for older businesses or less sophisticated companies, for sure.
Well, I mean, there's also different ways to interpret it. So usually
Yeah.
when I've seen it, people go, well, did you include this segment or exclude this segment? What about people who did X, Y, Z? Did you include them or exclude them? Are they defined as this or this?
Yeah, so you're partially getting into the definitions of stuff, and that is important. There's another, maybe deeper sense of what single source of truth means. Imagine if you want to ask a question like, well, how many people visited the website? You know, you can have somebody who logs into Google Analytics and they get one number. You could have somebody who counts mobile and web sessions through some internal tool. They get a different number. Then, you know, somebody else could have some other cockamamie thing with doing grep on the logs and then come up with a third number. And the question is, well, who's right? Why don't all these numbers agree?
Well, that's a question. What do you do in your field?
Well, I mean, for me, you have to take one thing as golden. Like, there isn't necessarily a perfect measurement. So if for whatever reason you have two different tracking systems tracking the same thing, either you need to average them or benchmark them or just ignore one. But the company does, or the organization, whatever, has to have a single source of truth. There's one and only one place you go to get some piece of data. And you shouldn't have to collect it across three different parties. There should be an agreed upon canonical source of data.
For each business, so each business would agree for themselves.
Yeah. Now, a business units might not share data across them. You know, you could see where a very large company that does multiple things, they could have siloed kind of pieces, and that might be fine. But if somebody says, what are the numbers for unique visitors to the website today, there should be one and only one place to get that number.
So are you asking that businesses go through and say, who owns this data point?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's organizational challenges around, like, how do you get this done? And that's going to vary by company. And, of course, everyone has the correct way to do it and everyone else's way is wrong. But it's more just about the concept that you cannot allow an organization to have multiple ways of measuring something. There has to be a single, unified place where you go to get a number. And then, most importantly, ultimately, you're going to have to aggregate your data in some way. Let's say you're like a large e-commerce company. You track all of the transactional data. Or let's say a grocery store. They have somewhere a log of, like, you know, this order was made up, but you bought 4 apples, 3 bananas, and whatever else. But that granularity of data is not very useful for most questions. If you have a question like, you know, what are sales figures for the Northeast? You don't want to have some computer counting apples and oranges to get this number back. There has to be aggregates in place, you know, so aggregate each store by hour and each store by day and that kind of stuff. This is where you get into data warehousing type topics.
Is that what we're talking about today?
A little bit, yeah. That's the data warehouse is most people's solution for achieving a single source of truth. Do you knowingly interact with many data warehouses in your day-to-day life?
Me?
Yeah.
I don't directly know.
All right. Well, where do you get data from in your job?
We have an analytics dashboard called Looker that we use.
Yeah, they're not a sponsor, but I know the product and many people respect it. I have a client that uses it and they love it.
Well, there's data on the products, how the sales are doing. There's data on how many people are hitting our website, how many people are subscribing.
So is your dashboard the single source of truth, or do other people go other places and come back with different numbers?
I think they go other places as well sometimes.
Be better to unify that. But if those other places are sort of mutually exclusive, then sort of philosophically that might be okay. Well, I thought it'd be interesting perhaps to talk through the source of these deltas. Why should it be that people don't agree on the truth?
I thought you said because people aren't looking at the same data.
Yeah, but why shouldn't those two data points agree? You know, if you go to 10 different mechanics, one would hope that they all diagnose the same problem.
Well, I'm sure it's about the segments. Do they count this customer as someone who subscribed or not? Are they including them? Are they excluding them? The people who unsubscribed, then resubscribed? Are they new subscribers? Are they resubscribed?
Yep, those are all great examples of like different filtering criteria that people will get confused about. One thing that's kind of frustrating to me is the term like active users, because at some point you have to just define that arbitrarily, and then everyone has to use the same arbitrary thing. You know, whether it's people who've logged in 7 days, or other companies will pick 180 days if they want to inflate their numbers or something. If everyone uses a different number, you all get different results. Another one, things being out of date. So there could be one system that is not updated, like, you know, maybe there's some system that records sales, but it doesn't account for returns and stuff later. And so if you look at that, it has out-of-date data. There could be, here's one that's very common, at least that I help people locate, when there's what I call a quiet ingestion failure. That means that somewhere data was supposed to flow into the system. That didn't happen for whatever reason, permissions, timeouts, network issues, whatever, and that it quietly fails and no one knows it failed.
So say it again, something data failed?
Yeah, so like let's say every night there's some job that's supposed to download data from AdWords and move it to the database, something like that. And one day, for whatever reason, that doesn't happen. And so there's like a hole in that day. It's just a zero. Or maybe it's worse yet would be a partial day, because usually a zero stands out like a sore thumb. There could just be half the data is missing for a couple days for some secret suppressed technical issue.
How come people aren't watching it?
Ooh, well, I mean, that's a complicated question, and it's really going to depend on the situation. But probably, you know, it's a whole bunch of people, like there's no one who says that's my job to do that. Somebody built that process a long time ago and they thought it was set it and forget it. They didn't put any checks around it, maybe. Ooh, here's a fun one. Time zones. Can you imagine how time zones would become a point of frustration when getting to a single source of truth?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to say on Monday how many people subscribed, then you got to ask what time zone are you talking about? And when does the day roll over?
You might even have to figure out what is the format that it stored the database, because maybe some lazy developer did it differently from everybody else, and now you got two different forms of time in your system.
Yep, that's true. These are all good points. So how do people work through these points? I don't understand. We're just listing problems.
Yeah, I mean, there's no one global solution. It's going to depend on the organization, what their data is, and where they put it. So if you're a well-structured company, let's say, and you use a transactional database like a MySQL or a SQL Server or Postgres or something like that, and your application developers have done a good job, then your data is going to be really standardized. If your application developers have not done a good job, then you're going to have all this goofy stuff in there where columns mean different things for different periods of times, and there's outages of data that aren't annotated anywhere. But forgetting about all that, let's just say the transactional data is good. Well, you've still got to turn that into something else. For the example I brought up earlier, if you want to know grocery sales in the Northeast, you don't need to count boxes of graham crackers. You need to know total order sizes or even daily store, revenue or something like that. So that data has to be aggregated. As soon as you aggregate something, technically you've copied it.
Yeah.
So what if the original changes? How does the copy get updated?
I don't know. How does it? How do data people deal with this?
Well, it depends. I mean, usually the best bet is you don't let anything append, you do append only. so that data only goes forward. So in that regard, like if someone returns something, you would count the returns against the current day, the day of the return. Even though, like, logically, you might be like, no, let's go back and zero out that sale the day it came in or something like that. Depending on, what question you're trying to answer, both of those approaches are valid. But if you count things as they happen in this event-driven format, then you can take a append-only approach that databases are only inserted to, never updated. And if that's true, then aggregation's pretty easy, because if the past can't change, then you can aggregate at any time. But if the past can change, users can go update some user table indirectly or whatever, then the aggregates either have to be triggered to rerun like all of them, which would be a waste, or you can mark records as dirty, and then the aggregation process could aggregate them and clean that up. And I don't know, those are two strategies I've employed. I'm sure there's 6 other ideas if we had some BI professionals here.
It's interesting because I do the QuickBooks for our business.
Yes.
And then sometimes there are returns and whatnot and refunds or whatever. And I also have to go back and figure out how should I record this data.
Yeah.
Because that would also depend on when I run the data, how it's going to show up on the books. So I'm like, if there's a return, I just mark the return on the date.
Why are people returning stuff? Don't they like our t-shirts?
No, I mean us. Like if we bought like a filing cabinet and we returned it on the credit card, then it's like, how do I mark that to show that in the data while still being accurate?
Yeah, I mean...
it's all very hard, and I have to be consistent, too.
If a filing cabinet is filed in the forest and no one hears it, is it still data? I don't know.
No, I'm saying when you return things, you can mark it as a return, you can mark it as like credit, you can mark it as...
So one way to get your spending down next month is to buy a bunch of stuff this month and return it, right?
Well, it's hard because if I bought a filing cabinet, we get a tax deduction, right? But anyways, sounds like you don't understand, so we'll move on.
Thanks to this week's sponsor, the Great Courses Plus. This is a great solution for lifelong learners like myself. You can stream thousands of videos on science, history, travel, health, wellness, professional development, photography, cooking, and much, much more. There's new subjects and lectures added every month, and you can watch it on your TV, laptop, tablet, smartphone. Bring it with you on the go. The Great Courses Plus brings you serious lecture content. This week we want to highlight their course, Mathematical Decision Making. Professor Scott P. Stevens from James Madison University takes us on a whirlwind trip across 24 lectures, exploring some of my favorite topics like decision trees, Bayesian analysis, Markov models, queuing, and stochastic optimization. Oh, throw in time series forecasting as well. Not long ago, executives faced with complex problems made decisions based on experience and intuition. You probably know how I feel about that. I only care for intuition when it has data to back it up. And that's the message of modernity. In this course, you'll learn about time series forecasting, linear regression, and a lot of other tools to help you be a better decision maker, one that is data-driven and mathematically founded. Best of all, we've got a special offer for you this week. I want you to start benefiting from the Great Courses Plus 2, and Data Skeptic listeners can get unlimited access to their entire library for free. To start your free trial, head over to thegreatcoursesplus.com/data. Double check it. You got to get this right. They need to make mathematical decisions, and they do that by knowing where you came from. So let them know Data Skeptic told you to head over there. And it's thegreatcoursesplus.com/data.
I would say, I guess your strategy is use QuickBooks. Again, not a sponsor, but that's what you're using. And that's good because now you have one centralized place. So even if you mark these things in a weird way, like I'm sure somebody else who does books would come in and want to rename all of your categories, and a third person after that would say that the second person was also wrong and rename it all again. That's kind of the process. As long as it's all centralized, and even if somebody did rename all your categories and recategorize all your stuff, as long as their updates are now considered canonical, then you have one place to go and get this data.
Yeah, I mean, QuickBooks has helped me dealing with that. Well, if I run the data and I start seeing a problem, then I could go back and see where the problem is, and then I could recategorize something or put it in a different way if the report isn't showing up the way that I would expect.
So when I do like certain little things, like where I'll put together a spreadsheet that tracks a bunch of expenses or something, that's technically not a single source of truth, then I've broken your system, right?
Well, why would you do that? I haven't seen a spreadsheet from you.
I make spreadsheets all the time.
And you shared them with me?
Yeah, most of them. All the good ones. Yeah, the good
cost?
ones. Yeah, the fun ones, the interesting ones. Yeah.
Well, I don't view that as the actual cost of something until I see it show up in our bank account.
Aha. That's another good point, yeah.
I just wait for the bank account to show up. It's actually, there was an issue. Actually, okay, so there's this weird thing where I guess I wrote a check and it said one amount on the check.
Uh-huh.
But then when they cashed it, they cashed a different amount. But I didn't catch any discrepancy because...
Wait, higher or lower?
It was literally like a $2 difference or something, so I didn't notice anything.
It's one way to get a tip.
And then later on when I was running it, I was like... Because I only mark it as paid via the bank account. So whatever was deducted from our bank account, that's what I mark paid.
Okay.
I don't like write down from the checkbook in QuickBooks to expect this payment. Mm-hmm. I don't make a separate item. Mm-hmm. But it showed up later that it was different. But I didn't catch that until our contractor reached out and said, oh, it's a $2 difference than what you wrote on the check. And then I was like, really? So I went into the bank account. And this is actually just a tip for all you listeners. The scan check is actually off. So you guys should actually check that what you wrote on the check has actually got deducted. It also happened another time.
Well, because you write it twice on the check. You write it with cursive and you write the digits.
It doesn't matter. They're wrong. It happened again recently. $1 off on the contractor's payment based on what I wrote on the check and what they deducted.
I've never heard of this happening before.
Yeah, it's this automated whatever check scanning thing, I assume.
This sounds like the plot to Superman 4. Are you sure we're not being scammed?
Everyone should just be aware, give or take a few dollars, that it has been wrong.
All right.
And the point is, I didn't realize it because I don't make an invoice in QuickBooks. I just say, okay, it'll show up in the bank account when they deduct. Mm-hmm. But because of these issues, I was like, maybe I should just go ahead and create an invoice at the time I write the check. So that when it deducts, I'll match the two up. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll start doing that because the bank keeps getting it wrong. I'm not saying it's that big a deal, a few dollars, but I'm like, it's actually disturbing that the bank is wrong, period. So I'm telling this story to everyone as business owners to be like, you don't just write a check and don't leave it like open. You should actually create it in your however you're doing your accounting.
All right.
So that when you reconcile it, you're not just checking, oh, the bank is the source. Because I was going by the bank was the source of truth.
Well, you're kind of goofing up my episode here because that was what I was going to argue for. Generally, at a company, the one thing you can stake your claim on is that the revenue will be correct. You can't screw it up because the bank is involved.
It was correct.
You could
it was
do some
correct
end-around
in
stuff,
that is what was deducted, but it was not correct and that was what I actually intended to pay.
Well, the bank is always right.
This is what I'm saying. So it's like, well, yeah, if you say, you know what, it's off by a few dollars, I defer to the bank. And then I can make up the few dollars moving only in the future.
But QuickBooks connects to the bank, right? They download from there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yep. So the bank is the single source of truth. That tracks all the revenue. That's why, like I said, at most companies, revenue is going to be on point. You'll always know the right numbers there because at the end of the day, the money has to go somewhere. It has to actually end up in a bank, and that gets easily counted. And there's the balance. That's one easy metric you can look at. But when it comes to like web visits or user accounts created or, whatever widget kind of thing you're dealing with, it's easy in technology for you to have a bunch of systems that are counting different things in different ways and for those to get off. Another example is like streaming systems. Even though there is some very sophisticated technology that can help you handle stream processing, and that has like really revolutionized in the last, I would say, 5 to 8 years or so, there's still a chance that just stuff happens. Events get missed, buffers get overrun, network lag happens, and the stream won't always add up if you go back later and recount it. So a lot of companies who are doing streaming analytics kind of stuff, they'll have real time for the most recent stuff, and then they'll have a batch process that goes back and sort of reconciles everything so that there's a single source of truth that matches some log somewhere.
So it sounds like we should be treating our data as if we're our own bank.
Yeah, if you can. Not always possible, but that's ideal.
Who's responsible for this usually?
Well, you know what? In my opinion, that's usually the problem, is that organizations don't know how to answer that question. Everybody will answer it a little differently. You know, some people will say, oh, this is under the CIO if you're a big company, Chief Information Officer. Other places it falls under the CTO. Sometimes, and usually this is a mistake, but a CFO is in charge of stuff. And none of those are necessarily wrong answers. Every organization can run a little differently. But there needs to be someone, in my opinion, or some organization that facilitates for the whole company to the degree that the company needs to share the metrics. If it's like, the marketing team wants to just run the Twitter feed, and they're going to count the likes and the favorites and stuff, well, I don't care about that. Go count it whatever you want in your own system. But if we're going to talk about some standard like number of users, or a number of active users, we all have to agree on where do we get that data from. It's probably by counting the users table, not some other version of that, some intermediary representation that's stored. And then the aggregates that we use have to come directly from the core full grain tables. So you've got to provide all the people the right, clear, single source of truth for them to do individual analytics on.
Yep. There is an experience where at my work we were trying to identify how long subscribers stay subscribed.
Oh boy.
I looked at the data and then from
5 different answers.
The data, my conclusion was X. Users stay subscribed for X. We could just make up a number 1 year or something. When I brought it up with just 3 other people, they all jumped in. They're like, you shouldn't say that in your meeting. And I said, why? And they said, well, everyone's going to get derailed. They're going to start asking questions where their number came from because they're going to say, I heard it was this amount. And then someone's going to jump and say, I heard it was this amount. And so basically,
this is a common
it showed the problem that I was like, okay, no one's agreeing on what the data is actually saying.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we can't even talk about the data, which is actually a loss.
Yes.
We do want to use the data to get better.
That's the problem. A lot of organizations get stuck here. They get scared because no one can agree. And they're like, oh, I guess we just can't know this. Wrong answer. You got to have a single source where everyone agrees, for better or for worse. Yeah, counting tenure of customers, subscribers, whatever, can be tricky. For example, you have to account for something called a right censorship.
What's that mean?
Right censorship is where you'd want to count, like the obvious naive thing is count total current subscribers divided by all-time subscribers, right? And all-time is current plus canceled. But the canceled people, their lifetimes already because they ended. The active people, you don't know how long they're going to last. You could do some sort of survival analysis maybe, but you don't really know the average lifetime because if you just do it naively, the mathematics would be such that you assume everyone cancels today, and that's not true.
Right. So that was the basic math that I did just from looking at the data. I was like, oh, well, if everyone canceled today, this is the average. So how would you do that?
The way that is non-controversial, even though it's not very good, is only take canceled people to get the tenure dates because the cancellation event.
So it depends.
Yeah, so then you can say for sure, of the people who do cancel, which is everyone in the horizon, they stick around for this many days. But that's really, really bad for young companies because probably you're building momentum as you go, you're building loyalty as you go, so those numbers are overly conservative. But you'll get to a point, also the dynamics of the business can change, so you don't want to rely too much on historical data. But usually what you do is you figure out some survival analysis version of this where you're going to forecast out by cohort how long you think people are going to stick around based on the cancellations you've seen so far and historic trends and stuff like that. And there's a certain amount of modeling to it. Hopefully not too much modeling because this is an area people can go crazy and just do a lot of hand-wavy woo-woo stuff. But yeah, you have to find a way to account for this right censorship that of the people you'd like to count, you don't know yet their cancellation because it's in the future.
I feel like we need now a cancellation dashboard where someone has done all that data, then we could talk about it. So I guess this is why it's so hard to talk about certain numbers sometimes at companies because people actually have to do an analysis and own it.
Yeah. So,
and then they have to justify it. Then once they justify it, then they go, okay, now moving forward, this will be the single source of truth.
Yeah. And most of the time that justification can't be a 30-minute meeting where you talk about different plots you did. And
Right.
so at some point, there has to be some group, some business intelligence group or whatever
That has to own it,
Yeah.
and then, this is no wonder.
Yeah. Now, they also, in my opinion, need to defend it. They can't just say, this is what it is
they
because
definitely
I said
have
so.
to defend it,
Yeah. And that's a failure at a lot of places, too. But, you get one set of numbers, you attach whatever caveats and filters, and people go from there. But empower the people by giving them analytics, but give it to them in a digestible form where they can't make too many mistakes.
You just made me think a lot about, metrics. Every company has some key metrics that they need to, that they decide this is what we're going to measure to decide whether we're successful, whether we're doing well. And obviously the metrics can change year to year. But, it raises a question that, does the company you're working for, does everyone working for it, do people actually know what these metrics are that are valued by the company? And I feel like a lot of places you don't.
Yeah.
Because people aren't actively, there should be a simple set, maybe 5 metrics that people are constantly talking about. Here are the metrics that we want to align on. Or at least company, when I say, you say that, I'm saying company-wide discussion. You don't want every, I'm sure the ones that have a lot of data, they should be focused on more metrics, but for company-wide discussion level.
Well, my came from the fact that a lot of companies evolve into having metrics that are a little bit too financial, like P&L stuff or EBITDA. Nobody knows what EBITDA is, and it's not worth your time to find out. Your metric should be something like, if you're in customer service, calls serviced per day sounds pretty good, even though, that might go awry in certain situations. So you think every
team should have?
Yeah, probably.
But there should be a company-wide language.
Yeah, but it should also be the metric I care about is the one I can actually influence.
Well, there should be a team level, and then there should be a company-wide
You're right,
one.
You're right.
So that the company, when you have your all hands, you could say, together, this metric has gone up, and that was our goal.
Yep, and then hopefully you see the same metrics every time, rather than
right. So let's say there's 5 team level metrics and there's 5 company wide ones. Yeah. So every company needs to align on those and have some single source of truth. Some do because they ignore. I think it's easy to come up with a single source by just ignoring the other stuff. You're like, okay, great, let's just ignore that.
Well, that's dangerous too, because I've been at a lot of places where I saw some metrics on the board and I was like, that trend is not going in the right direction. I know that number is going down and you're showing it going up. Now, if you want to show 20% inflated than mine and you're consistently 20% higher, well, okay, we're just filtering something differently. But if I'm saying down and you're saying up, something's wrong.
Well, then that, I think if you're in a company that values open discussion or reevaluation and constant improvement, I'm sure you could bring that up in a nice way.
That would be ideal, yeah.
And maybe be like, maybe we should reevaluate it.
Maybe we should
KPIs.
Maybe we should have some KPIs for Data Skeptic 2019 that we share on the air. I don't know what those will be, but you could decide.
Oh, goodness.
How about minutes listened per something?
Goodness.
Anyway, we'll have to think about that.
I don't know. Please. We're not aligned. We'll have to align off air.
All right. Well, I want everyone to pay attention as the last thought here to our next episode. We're going to have an interview with a fact checker next Friday, actually about automated fact checking. And she has a wonderful story about 2 politicians who share 2 facts, and they definitely do not have a single source of truth. But it's an interesting result. So tune in next week.
Wow. Are you saying you interviewed both of them?
No, I interviewed just the fact-checking person.
Oh, okay. So this is kind of like a soap opera, but as much as the soap opera.
Yeah, I'm going to put some real dramatic music under here for this cliffhanger. Tune in next time. When you hear the
anecdote. I love drama, so I think I just might have to tune in.
All right, then.
So I'm encouraging all you soap opera loving people. I think it might be
I'm going more action movie than soap opera with this song, but yeah, okay.
No, I think soap opera people will love this. So
right.
Tune in.
Well, we'll A/B test it. Anyway, thanks as always for joining me, Linda.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Data Skeptic, where the news may be fake, but the data doesn't lie. Show your support by getting a t-shirt at dataskeptic.com.